Hey everyone, joining in here, Mark Buzan. If you're just seeing us right now, we're starting another live broadcast after being away for the last couple of days. Thank you for joining in with us. If you are not familiar with me at all, my name is Mark Buzan. I am the founder of the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors of our Executive Director Association Management Services, where we offer a variety of directly nonprofit and particularly association management services, from executive director, interim services, full management services, and down to fundraising and consulting and membership drives as well, a whole gamut of things. I'm joining you from today. We're from our wonderful co-working space here in Gatineau, Quebec, Canada, just the National Capital Region. Live streaming here from Facebook on the page of the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors, from Periscope, from YouTube as well, and later on we'll be joining you from LinkedIn, all things working out fine as well later. So again, if you're interested in learning more about interacting with this, you'll find later down below in the descriptor of this broadcast a link directly over to Zoom. The technology has not unfortunately kept up with us, with the ability to be able to interact and chat with you directly through the various platforms. Love to have that happen, but that's not to be the case. The best way of doing that is you can interact with me directly here on Zoom. The invitation is open and wide open, so just click on the link and it'll prop up your browser, and happy to take any kind of questions as well during this discussion. I want this to be a back and forth on this. Today's subject is on a provocative, admittedly, call to arms, if you will. Nonprofits, board directors and executive directors alike, are you tired of being held hostage by grants funders, foundations, governments, all alike, who are not interested in funding your capital needs? And what do I mean by capital needs? I mean everything from building uptake to training your people, whether that's on the board or your staff, whether it's learning and getting good governance systems and financial procedures in place. All of the necessary items that are perhaps less tangible directly related to what one views as a nonprofit being their service delivery, but nonetheless so critical for their long-term sustainability. Too often enough, I find that our organizations that are going after these kinds of grants are finding themselves funded by grant makers who don't really see the importance of this, or they're just simply not interested in this. So if you really are interested in learning more about this subject and what you can do as an organization to get yourself off of what I call the constant roller coaster of being funded and not funded throughout the process, or being at the mercy, frankly, as an organization of grant funders who don't really get your vision and the need for long-term things, heart this presentation, because particularly if you're here on Facebook, as I understand, Facebook loves the hearts. It loves the hearts, and that helps get the message out on the importance of what nonprofits can do to get themselves much more sustainably funded as well. Share the message as well. If you were interested in getting any kind of the resources, or want to talk a little bit about what this means for your organization as well, hashtag this. Say, hashtag it, show me the money. Hashtag it as well, saying, let me know. We're curious just to know if you're watching this live. Hashtag it live as well. If you're watching this as a replay, hashtag it as a replay as well, okay? Again, let's talk a little bit about this issue here. So before we get going on that, I'm going to just do a little housekeeping. We're going to hit the record button of this to get this going as well. Okay, for those of us joining again, we're going to be talking about the problem of why and how challenging it is for not-for-profits to be constantly being held hostage by the inability of grant makers to want to fund capital needs, basically. So the irony of this whole debate is that many of them perceive that they don't want to be involved in funding what they like to call overhead. forcing, unfortunately, irony of a situation which puts nonprofits in a place where they're in a constant feast and famine, or what I call the nonprofit starvation cycle. But the irony of all of it is that most nonprofit organizations, for them to be able to sustainably grow, have to be willing and able to invest in some of those things, like training of their board members, like having good physical assets, keeping and hiring good paying staff. This problem permutates. I see it happening quite often. If I'm on nonprofit board forums on all over Reddit and wherever, and I ask a lot of staff as to what's their number one beef really about nonprofit, their nonprofit service, and they put the blame out on boards, saying that they're cheap and they don't want to be able to pay them. Well, maybe there's an element of that, but I think that honestly is missing part of the real issue here. When nonprofits set themselves out towards being funded largely by grants, and grant makers themselves only wanting to fund short-term project delivery or service deliveries there, it misses the opportunity for the executive director and for the board as a whole to be focusing on the broader aspects of organizational capacity and growing them as well. So this forces a situation where often enough that they're only able to focus on the immediate and not able to focus on the broader growth aspects to be able to support that and pay staff, for example, the better things. Again, grant sources, if you get them, the part of the challenge is that they tend to be about pet projects, what they deem as important. Often enough, though, unfortunately, with many foundations, because they fund a variety of different causes or initiatives, even if they're focused on a broad subject, they're not necessarily always aware of what are the underlying challenges that deal with that issue. Again, forcing nonprofits, because of the fact that they want to keep the doors open, saying, okay, well, we got to go after this and then service this particular need and all the paperwork that comes with it to keep that funder happy. The result is that often enough, particularly because if they need to get enough of these grants together, is that nonprofits, they're always trying to cobble together a patchwork of funding sources. And they're subjected as a result of this to a lot of redundant paperwork and forced to deliver services now rather than invest in long-term strengthening of the organization, which in the end would actually make the organization much more able to deliver a lot of these services more efficiently, more effectively, more strategically as well, and make, as a result, this a better society. The challenge of all of this patchwork there, is it often ends up hollowing out non-for-profit organizations with, as I mentioned earlier, higher turnover rates in staff and an inability for the organization to be self-sufficient, setting in place the necessary investments so that the organization can not just always be asking for money, but can be a fisher of opportunities and of growth. Now, an interesting study I read recently in the United States is that 1 in 4 nonprofit organizations don't really even have enough money, if you can imagine, for more than 30 days of expenses. And that's just crazy if you think about that. They don't have that ability to be able to reach beyond 30 days. How is an organization supposed to take on a very complex challenge, let's say, for example, like hunger, beyond a 30-day horizon? Now, during tough times, the result of these constraints of grant monies is that nonprofits also lose their resiliency in being able to adapt to changing environments. I've been in contact with executive directors or nonprofit board members who say, you know, back in the day, we were really on point and on game, and we were focused on this, and we were getting grant monies and we were delivering services, but suddenly, all of a sudden, either our service needs have changed, and as a result, more often than not, the grant funders' needs or view or passion for that particular cause has moved or fluctuated this, and then there's a big scramble at the last minute to be able to keep up in touch with this. If any of you can relate to some of this as well, like heart this, send a little bit of comment and say, preach on, if you will, there, because I'm surely I'm not the only one that's seen all these kinds of challenges out there. Okay, again, if you're with us now there, we're here broadcasting. Below, you can see the link for the Zoom link to be able to connect with us live. If you're with us and you want to leave a comment and chat, let me know on this. That's great to have that your thoughts on this. Now, the other part of this whole biggest challenge is that most grants are too short in vision when most societal issues, as I mentioned, are long term. And the patchwork of grants, as I mentioned earlier, creates many masters. This is my other personal beef about things. I'm a firm believer that while some will say that the role of the executive director is to lead, I really firmly believe, that that's a bit of a cop-out. And then it's actually a role that the board itself needs to be exercising a certain degree of leadership as well, with the executive director being the conciliary, the advisor in this. But when you have a series of a patchwork of funders coming in, all with their perspective ideas of what's important, it forces board discussions to be very short-term focused on keeping these different funders happy so that you can somehow put this all together. And this, in my opinion, diverts the role of the board from more a forward, future-looking thinking towards steady growth. Now, a Bridgespan Group study surveyed nonprofit organizations a number of years ago from their inception to where they were at something over a period of 1970 to 2003. So I'm going a little bit back, but the most interesting thing is that they were finding that the most sustainable organizations were ones who were invested on maximizing their capacity to get and manage funds. One of the other challenges of being held hostage to these grant fundings with all these kinds of things, who are not interested, they're interested in delivering particular funding, rather than focusing in the investment of the long-term ability of that organization to go out and do business development, to go out and do fundraising correctly, is that they miss the mark and to be able to always to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. This study from Bridgespan Group found that those organizations that had done the best were ones that were slicing their time aside to be able to invest in their organization's abilities to fundraise, to diversify, to grow, and build relationships with steadworth partners. Now, these organizations also found, or this study also found, that it showed the importance of having the right partners. And often enough, sometimes some of the worst partners, I hate to say this out there for this, tends to be government grants, because they are particularly driven by often political agenda that wants to focus on delivering an immediate result. And often it's about the paperwork, whereas in the previous broadcast as well, I found it was as much as 31%. If you can imagine, 31% of grant values sometimes going just towards the administration of the money being given. Now, the other part of all of this challenge and this hostage taking of the mismatch between grant fund providers and nonprofits and their service delivery is that most foundation staff unfortunately aren't trained to know the nature of money and how it's necessarily used in the sector and how that relates to this. A Rockefeller and Fannie Mae Foundation study found that there are about 3 types of capital funding that all organizations really do need in order to be sustainable. And this is often not the case that you find in grant funding. So the first kind is that, depending on your organization, is facilities capital. Right? So that's your buildings and what's that. Second, and the most common and the most important one there, is working capital. So that covers off low cash flow situations, strategic investments, and like building your capacity as well. As I mentioned, one of the most important elements of that is building your revenue generating capacity as well on a long-term sustainable basis. And the third type is permanent capital, and that includes building up in your organization some reserves funds and other kinds of capital areas like that. So what I'm finding is, and then the final element there is that where this challenge and why I'm so quote unquote anti-grant, there's some caveats on this, is that often enough the grants our grant applications, as I've witnessed, are run very much like a very impersonal RFP process, where a call for funding is put out. Grant funders may sometimes be, or less like RFP providers, rather kind of keeping their cards close to their chest and saying, for fear of not coming off as being too preferential to one cause or another, saying, answer the question, and that's it. No interpretation on it. And this leads to the fact of what I mentioned in the previous broadcast as well. If you're interested in getting a link on that, let me know. Is that actually the majority of first-time, the fact is that the majority of first-time grant applications are actually denied. And this happens particularly for startups or smaller organizations as well, who don't necessarily have the experience and want to be able to fill out that paperwork as well. So again, all of this is a big area of challenge, not the least of which, as I mentioned as well, is that, in my opinion, that it de-responsibilizes, if that's the word, boards from their role in investing in and thinking about future capacity building of the organization and what that can and should look like. So if you're interested in learning more about what it is your organization can and should do, there's a number of resources that are offered through the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors. I encourage you as well to join our most recently formed Facebook group called Nonprofit Fundraising Hackers on Facebook. Email me, or you can reach me and message me directly below. I'm happy to send you the link and the invite to that group if you're interested in that. But there are three things that you guys who are in the not-for-profit sector, particularly if you're on the board, need to be thinking about. One, you need to be building your customer base, if you will, offering something that's in exchange for their contribution. What I mean by your customer base, the most sustainable organizations are ones that have a wide base of individual donors, members, funders, sponsors, whatever that may be, so that you can weather the storms of when someone can join and when they can support you and when they cannot. But they're also just not simply going and making, as I call it, guilting people to supporting the organization. They're coming up with innovative ways of something of value, a contribution in exchange for their support of the organization as well. Two, they're proving to all involved that the organization fulfills a genuine need, and this funding towards the capital funding actually relates to the services that they have to deliver. So they're making that connection. They're becoming good storytellers as well. And third, of course, they're demonstrating very clearly that they've got sound financials and that the board is on top of things and that they are wise financial stewards of donors, supporters, members, investment in the organization as well. Folks, if you're really interested in learning more about all of these subjects, as I mentioned, we've got a great new group that's on Facebook called Nonprofit Fundraising Hackers. Love to have you with us. Leave a comment, as I mentioned, down below as well in this broadcast. Like I said, we're broadcasting here live from Periscope, from Facebook on the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors Facebook page, as well as on YouTube as well. And of course, stay tuned for this. Keep this link remains the same, and love to have you on our next broadcast where you can partake in the discussion live as well. Thanks all, everyone, and have a great day. Get the message out, heart this, share this, and thanks for your support.